I think that's all the news. You know, as I read history today, there's one or two things that are pretty dramatic. And so I'll let you pick it up. And I'll start with, in 1858, Abraham Lincoln said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And that was, today was an anniversary of that. And I did not realize that was said while accepting his nomination by the Republican Party for senator. In 1884, America had its first roller coaster. And of course, Coney Island, New York. In 1893, a German-American, F.W. Roschheim, introduced Cracker Jack as a snack food. In 1897, a treaty annexing the Republic of Hawaii to the U.S. was signed. In 1903, Ford Motor, under Henry Ford, was incorporated and founded. In 1903, and I think this is even more important, Pepsi-Cola was formed. In 1909, the first U.S. airplane was sold commercially by Glenn Curtiss for $5,000. In 1933, the Federal Deposit Insurance, FDIC, was created. In 1961, and I bet we all remember this, the Soviet ballet dancer Rodolph Nureyev, I messed his last name up, defected to the West, and I think we all remember that as such a dramatic occasion. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter and Panama leader Omar Torrijos signed the ratification for the Panama Canal. In other words, Panama was on its own. In 2017, Amazon announced it was buying Whole Food Market for $13,700 billion. In 2017, President Donald Trump reinstated Cuba travel and business restrictions after they were loosened by President Obama. In 2023, 30-year-old U.S. cosmetic company Revlon filed for bankruptcy. In 2023, U.S. truck driver Robert Bowers was found guilty of the deadliest attack on Jews in the U.S. shooting, killing 11 worshipers in Pittsburgh at that synagogue. In 2024, a 105-year-old Virginian history graduate with master's diploma in education graduated from Stanford University. It was 83 years after she had dropped out college. Now, birthdays. Apache leader Geronimo. Pays to be ignorant comedian Bobby Clark. English comedian Stan Laurel. Newspaper publisher Katharine Graham. American pop, rhythm and blues Little Caesar, and of course the golfer Phil Mickelson. Now, what you've been waiting for. It's my pleasure to turn the mic over to club member and genealogy chairman Maggie Winter, who will introduce today's speaker. like we've all been waiting for. And you have to give Maggie a big hand because she found us today's speaker. Hello, Maggie.
Well, as Sherry just said, I did find him, but I had a lot of help from my friends. My dear friend Raylan Henderson, whom I happen to sing with in a couple of choirs, one of them the Messiah Choral Society at Rollins. She lives in the same complex as Frank, and he was giving a talk in their community room, and she said, Maggie, I think this is right up your alley. Why don't you come? And I did. And I was enthralled. I immediately came back and told Sherry and Ovid about him. I was so touched by everything he had to say. Frank just told me now that, to his knowledge, there are only 6 grandchildren left in the United States. Children of Titanic survivors. I'm going to look into that. And so we are really just, it's amazing that we have him here to talk to you today, because he's going to talk about how a working class family from Kent, England happened to find themselves on the Titanic and how much it changed their lives. And his father, Frank John Goldsmith II, who was a survivor of the Titanic, wrote a book, Echoes in the Night, Memories of a Titanic Survivor. And it is out of print, and I've tried to get a hold of it. There are waiting lists at every used book site I can find of a few thousand people. As it turns out, Echoes in the Night, Memories of a Titanic Survivor, his father's book, was the only book ever written, according to the Titanic Society, by a third-class passenger survivor. There are other books been written by the more wealthy passengers on the Titanic. So it's a fascinating story. I just told Frank I'm always fascinated by brave women, and his grandmother was a very brave lady. So I turn the mic over to Frank.
Thank you, Maggie.
I'm going to have to get in the corner there to do the slideshow.
I'll use the mic as much as I can, but I will probably also be over there talking to you very loud from the table in the center. Up on the screen, you see a picture of my forebears, taken in 1906 in Strood, England. Strood is a small town across the Medway River from Rochester, where my grandmother and grandfather lived. This house where the picture is taken is still there, and a reporter from England informed me about 4 years ago that he visited. It's still there, and it looked like it had the same curtain in the window. But that lace curtain was probably standard in everybody's window down the street. In the picture, you'll see my grandfather standing, Frank John Goldsmith, my grandmother, Emily Alice Goldsmith, and in her lap is the baby Albert, known as Bertie, who was my uncle. And the little boy standing there was just turned 4 years old, which is the reason for the picture. It was for his 4th birthday. And he's wearing a little Lord Fauntleroy suit, which I think that grandmother probably made because she was an expert seamstress. Grandmother was the oldest of 12 children in the Brown family. And she went to work as a maid in somebody's house when she was 12 years old. She had, 2 years later, she had a sister who turned 12 who went to work also. Grandfather was apprenticed to a machine shop when he was 12 or 14 years old, because kids from working class families worked. They met somewhere around the turn of the century and married and my dad was born in 1902. Grandmother's family, most of them, had emigrated to the United States and Canada, with a large number of them in Detroit, Michigan, being employed by the burgeoning automobile industry. And they kept urging Grandma and Grandpa to come over and get a better job in the United States and live where it was free. And Grandma wanted to do that because she missed her family, her parents and her brothers and sisters. Grandpa wasn't so eager to do that. His family was all in England. And he was afraid to cross the ocean because he couldn't swim. Didn't want to do that. Well, along about 1911, little Birdie was then 5 or 6, I don't know, 5, died of diphtheria in December 1911. And then they got another request to come to the United States, and they thought it over, and they had heard about this wonderful ship, the Titanic, which was virtually unsinkable. So that was good for Grandpa. So they decided, yeah, maybe it was time. With the loss of Birdie, they needed to have a new start with their little family. And they booked passage on the Titanic. In preparing for their trip, they acquired, or grandfather built, a large crate to transport some of the household goods that they were going to take with them, which included my grandmother's brand new Singer sewing machine, which was carefully wrapped in the hall rug and put in the box. My grandfather also had a set of tools given to him by his workmates, calipers and things for his work as a precision machinist. And that went in the box. But my dad, who was enthralled with the cowboys and Indians in the United States, had a cap pistol that he wanted to take. Grandma was firmly against it. She didn't like him even having it, but he had traded a rubber ball to a friend for it. So he wanted to take his gun because he was sure he'd run into Indians and need to shoot at them. Unbeknownst to Grandma, he tucked it into the folds of that rug that was wrapped around her sewing machine, so it was going to go. He told his other grandma, my grandmother was the one who was his mother. His other grandmother, Grandma Goldsmith, said, I don't know why you're excited to go to the United States. The people there live in mud huts, because she had seen pictures of the sod houses in the prairies. But he wasn't going to be turned away. He thought it was really going to be exciting. There were cops and robbers, and there were posses and cowboys and Indians, and all exciting. He was very excited about this wonderful trip. On the day that they were to leave Strood and head for Southampton, they were joined by two people, Mr. Tom Theobald, who was a family friend. Grandma and Grandpa and the Theobalds were couple friends. They would get together and play cards or have a meal together. And Mr. Theobald was going to go to the United States, get a job, and then send for his wife. And then they also were going to chaperone a 15-year-old boy by the name of Alfred George John Rush. Alfred Rush had a brother in Detroit who knew part of Grandma's family, and they were looking for someone to watch out for him on the trip. And so Grandma and Grandpa agreed to act as chaperones for this 15-year-old kid. And they all boarded a train from Strood or Rochester, wherever they got the train, I don't know, probably Rochester, and went up to London, where they changed trains and got on the boat train, which traveled from London to Southampton on days of notable ship sailing, and arrived in Southampton finally that morning, April 10th, at around 10 o'clock. There in front of them was the Titanic, the largest man-made moving object in the world at the time. Over 800 feet long, 11 stories high. It was gigantic. Now, if you were first class, you went to the little building next to the ship and went to the top deck and across a gangway that took you into the first class section of the ship. If you were second class, you went up part way and went across a gangway into what was the second class area of the ship. But if you were third class, and most of the passengers on the ship were third class, because that was the business of the ship, was to get immigrants to the United States. That was the cash crop, if you will. And you entered from the wharf directly across a gangplank into a lower part of the Titanic. But first, before you went in, you had to be inspected by a doctor. They had to check you to see if you had lice, or if you had conjunctivitis, which is pink eye. So I imagine these doctors checking heads and eyes were maybe capable of passing more germs than they caught. Once aboard the ship, now I'm going to get my little model of the ship. Can you hear me if I talk over here? No. Because I talk pretty loud.
Can we move the podium over?
I could give him a hand one.
We can give him a hand mic.
I have a model of the ship here.
You can, okay.
Oh, I can't do that.
Can't do that.
Here, I can. Okay. Well, no, I can do it. Okay, is it on? Yeah. All right. Their cabin was at the stern of the ship below.
I'm going to help you. I'll hold it.
Okay. Their cabin was at the stern of the ship below the well deck here, where the cranes are located, but they were back here where family third class cabins were, below the poop deck. Single men in third class were up front where the crew was. Single women were about back here, away from the single men. Wonder how that worked out. At any rate, when you were traveling aboard ship back in 1912, there was no planned activities for children, and basically children were let out to play. Grandma would let Dad out to find playmates. And he did. About this time, one of the neighbors I don't know what's on the board. Can we change this? Excuse me, Susan?
Yep, got it.
Let's go to the cabin. Here we are. The cabin just had 4 bunks. As you can see, this is a family cabin. And on the back wall is a sink, which always had just cold water, but there was running water. The bathrooms were down the hall, and there were, for the third class, there were 3 bathtubs. And you had to make an appointment and pay for the privilege of taking a bath. And that's for more than 1,000 people. But there was nothing for kids to do. Well, one of grandmother's neighbors, Mrs. Abbott, who had been in the United States, married a prize fighter, divorced him with her 2 children, went back to England, and the kids didn't like it in England, so they were traveling back to the United States again. She had been all over a boat. She knew her way around the ship and could help grandmother and others. I'm going to put this down. It is easier for me to talk with the microphone, I guess. Where was I? Okay, Mrs. Abbott organized several of the English-speaking ladies in the area where this cabin was. There was a Mrs. Simpson and a Mrs. I don't know all their names, but Mrs. Abbott is the one that's important in this story. She had two boys, Chasmere, who was 13 or 14, and Eugene, who was about 11. And they had traveled back and forth, so they knew their way around ships. And they organized my dad and other little boys to tour the ship, to poke around and see what they could find. And they went all over the ship. My dad called them his posse. They went upstairs where they weren't supposed to. They went downstairs where they weren't supposed to. They even got up to the boat deck before they got chased away. They went down the stairs where they could see the firemen putting coal into the furnaces. And Dad said he remembered that while they were shoveling the coal, they were singing a chanty to keep rhythm. And they did that for hours a day. It took 600 tons of coal a day to keep that big ship moving. When they were on the poop deck, which is where the third class was allowed to go to get fresh air, the older boys dared my dad to travel up the cable holding one of these cranes that lowered the cargo in. Go hand over hand to climb up that cable. My dad was a daring little kid. He was a happy boy. Sure, I'll take a dare. Up the cable, which was covered with black grease to keep it from corroding in the sea air. So now he's got to face my grandma. She had to clean him in that cold water sink. I don't know about you with your grandmothers, but my grandmother, when she washed my hands, she used lava soap, which had pumice in it. I can imagine what she did to my dad, trying to scrub that black grease off of him. Anyway, that's the way their days went. Grandma with the English-speaking little group that Mrs. Abbott had formed, Dad with the Abbott boys and others, traveling around as much as they could, peeking and getting into trouble, minor trouble, all over the ship. That's the way they sailed on a Wednesday. And that's the way it was through Saturday. Sunday morning, there was a church service in the second-class salon, and grandmother and dad went. I don't know if my grandfather went or not. I sort of don't know a whole lot about what he did, but I think he was probably in the smoking room with the other guys and men his age, talking about their hopes and dreams and what they were going to do in the United States and how it was going to be good for them. But Grandma and Dad went to the church service in the morning. Then when they all met and went to lunch, we were going to go back outside, but it had turned very cold all of a sudden. And instead of going outside for any time at all, they went back to their cabin. And after dinner, they retired to their cabin again and put Dad to bed early. And Grandma and Grandpa sat on one of the bunks and were talking late into the night. Well, they didn't. That's when the ship plowed forward and hit the iceberg. I showed you where they were located at the back. Well, the ship hit the iceberg on the starboard or right-hand side on the front, but below the water line. So there was nothing visible above the water line. This ship was built so that it could stay afloat with any 4 compartments, watertight compartments filled, would stay afloat and would be its own life raft if necessary. Unfortunately, the blow against the iceberg was a glancing blow against an underwater bit of ice and pierced and opened up 6 compartments. When the ship's designer toured the ship immediately after, it was clear to him that the ship would sink, and he informed the captain. Well, it took time to get everything organized. First thing my grandparents knew was that the engines had stopped. And it was silent, because where they were back there, every time those propellers were going all day long, and so there was a rumble and a vibration. And they looked at each other and, what's going on? The engines have stopped. It's too quiet. So grandmother, I can hear her saying, Frank, go out and find out what's going on. So he put on a jacket or whatever and went out to find out what was going on. While he was gone, one of the ship's doctors rapped on the door and told grandmother that they should dress in warm clothes and put on their life vests and go to the second-class saloon. Then Grandpa came back, and he brought Tom, Theobald, and Alfred with him. So they were all together. And they had been given the same instructions where they were in the forward part of the ship and had their life vests on. Well, Grandpa didn't think it looked very good with the life vest on, but he put it on and then he put his overcoat over it, packed a little bag with their papers and their money in it, and they all proceeded to the second-class dining salon where there were families sitting around. It was like here, little groups everywhere. They could see their friends, and the 5 of them stood there. There was not much going on. It was warm. It was lighted in there. The ship was level at this time. And this was, let's see, the ship hit the iceberg at 20 to 12. This was probably 10 after 12 or a quarter after 12 when they made it to the second-class salon. But still nothing was going on. It was just quiet, and people were talking, wondering what was going to happen. They heard that people were going into the lifeboats, but they weren't sure why, because the talk was they'd bring them back for breakfast. It wouldn't be too long. But as they stood there longer and longer and longer, the ship started tilting a little more toward the bow. And they got more concerned, but there wasn't anything they could do. They were told and obeyed to stay there. They were fortunate because they were English and the orders being given were in English. If you excuse me, I'm going to sit for a minute. I'm getting old. You don't know what that's about, do you? So, along about, I would say 20 minutes past 1 o'clock, there was a definite tilt to the ship. They realized that it was getting worse. And they finally got instructions to go up the back staircase to the boat deck. And my dad said, probably like being in Disney, where it's take a step forward, a step forward, a step forward, and it takes forever. They finally get up to B deck, and on B deck, which is one deck below where the lifeboats were, there were crew, and they were separating the families there, that only women and children could proceed, that the men had to stand back until for later lifeboats. Grandpa grabbed Grandma and gave her a kiss and a hug. put his hand on my dad's head or shoulder and said, "So long, Frankie, I'll see you later." Mr. Theobald took off his wedding ring and gave it to Grandma and said, "If I don't make it to New York, see that my wife gets this." And Grandma and Dad and Alfred were to go up to the boat deck. Well, Alfred had just turned 16 that day and had his first long pants on. And when they were going to have him go up with the women and children, he stepped back and said, "I'll stay here with the men." So Grandma and Dad went up the ladder. Do you know what a ladder is on a ship? It's the outside staircase. It's usually made of iron or something, and the water can go through it. It's just an open work stairway. I, for a long time, thought of them going up a ladder like I know, but ladder is the term for the outside stairway, so they weren't climbing up like a painter's ladder or anything. It was a stairway. They got up on the boat deck, and they were back they came out by the fourth funnel. Well, it's a long way forward. That boat was, there were still 2 football fields ahead of them to get to where the lifeboats were being lowered. But slowly, this whole group, Mrs. Abbott and her kids, were ahead of Grandma. Some number of people ahead. And slowly they all proceeded forward. And at this time, on the starboard side, there was one lifeboat there that was being filled. It was a collapsible boat, which means it had a wood bottom, and they had to put up canvas sides on it. There was one on the port side being loaded at the same time. So as they got nearer and nearer to the front of the boat, the front of the ship, toward the lifeboat, there was more confusion aboard the deck. People were starting to get excited because all of the wooden boats were already gone, and Grandma and Dad and the others in her group were stepping over the ropes of the lifeboats that had gone, past luggage that had been left behind. And there was this lifeboat ahead of them, and Mrs. Abbott went to get in with her 2 boys, and was informed that the older boy was too big. He was not allowed to go forward. They would not let him on, and Mrs. Abbott wasn't going to get on without him. So she stepped back with Eugene and Jasmine and stood on the deck toward the officers' cabins, which are right up front on that deck, and watched other people get into the lifeboat. In fact, she commented later that she could see Mrs. Goldsmith and Frankie sitting in the lifeboat. When the lifeboat was finally lowered, there was 1 seat left, and one of the men that had been helping to get women and children there had called out for if there were any more women and children to go. Was told no, there was 1 seat left, and he was told by crew that he might as well get in. Well, that man was J. Bruce Ismay, the owner of the White Star Line, the owner of the Titanic. And he got in that lifeboat. Grandma and Dad were on the port side near the bow of that lifeboat. They were fairly far forward. There were also 3 Chinese men on that boat, but they didn't speak English, and the crew, the English crew, thought they were women because they were small. They were wearing long overcoats that went almost to the floor, and they were all wearing hats that covered half their face. So there were 3 Chinamen, as my dad said, in the boat. And as they started to lower, now, at this time, the bow is, the ship is down, the bow is almost, the nameplates, or it says Titanic, almost underwater. The forward well deck is already full of water. And the ship is leaning to port. So if you're on the port side and you went down, it was straight down and not very far. If you're on the starboard side, where Dad and Grandma were, you were on the high side because the ship was leaning. So the lifeboat was scraping along the side, and the rivets stuck out. The 3 million rivets on this boat stuck out 1.5 inches or 2 inches, and the boat was catching on that as they were going down, threatening to tip them into the water. And they used the oars to push away to keep from going into the water. While they were going down, Dad said they passed a window and he could see stewards and stewardesses, young 15-year-olds, 14-year-olds, playing like they were playing tag in a room. And he thought they were going to get in a lot of trouble because they were smoking. Well, probably they didn't even get out of that room, because it wasn't long after Grandma and Dad were in the water that the ship took its final plunge. But once in the lifeboat was in the water and cut away, they rowed toward the stern, away from the ship, because it was obvious the ship was going to go forward and they didn't want to go down with it. Halfway back, the ship was still lighted at this time. From deep inside the ship came this rumbling roar. Grandma thought that the water had gotten to the boilers and the boilers had exploded or something like that. But what she was actually hearing was the ship beginning to break apart. Meanwhile, Mrs. Abbott and her boys were standing on the deck watching the crew trying to put together another collapsible lifeboat. And while they were watching, the ship started to take its final plunge and a wave came up over the deck. And that lifeboat washed off. And it washed Mrs. Abbott, holding on to her 2 boys, into the water. Well, the water was freezing cold. Those who had been in it said it was like 1,000 knives in your body. And the shock of it, she lost her boys. She lost track of them. Excuse me. She bobbed up and someone grabbed her and pulled her into that unfinished lifeboat, which was now swamped. But she was out of the water. As it turns out, she was the only woman saved who had actually been in the water completely. Grandma and Dad and their boat continued back. By now the lights had gone off on the ship, and the ship was breaking in half. The bow finally separated and went down, and the stern stood straight up. Then it fell back toward the water, and somebody in the lifeboat said, "Oh, she's going to float." Then it turned back up, and slowly, faster, disappeared from sight. There was no moon. There were only stars. Excuse me. Very dark. Grandma said she could not see the people next to her in the boat. She had my dad right here. She had pulled him close so he couldn't see or hear what was going on. But when someone said it was going to float, she had let go of him, and he looked up and he saw it go. Well, after that, there was this terrible sound. There was 1,000 people thrown into that icy water. And the screaming and the hollering from the people in the water was terrible. But they couldn't do anything about it. Their boat was completely filled. They couldn't go back and try to help anybody. Some of the lifeboats didn't have many people. In fact, one of them only had 28 people in it. And they had room for 40 more. But they didn't go back. Some of them decided they would maybe go back, but they would wait till the sound died down so they wouldn't be swamped. When they did go back, they didn't find but a couple of people, and one of the people, incidentally, was a Chinese laundryman who was floating on a door, and they rescued him. He was the last person rescued off the wreckage of the Titanic. Later in his life, he had a son when he was 65, and that son is one of the people in my class of children as survivors. And he has a Chinese restaurant in Wisconsin, near Chicago, just north of Chicago. I digress. Grandma and Dad are sitting in the lifeboat. There's no light, just the stars. The sound has ended. It's just quiet. The only sound is this quiet sobbing of people in the lifeboat. And my hero is my grandmother, who has just seen the ship go down, assuming that her husband is gone, their friends are gone, her sewing machine is gone, everything they own, her money, her papers are all gone, but she still has little Frankie here. And she covered him with a blanket or a coat or something to keep him warm, and he finally went to sleep. When he awoke, there was activity in the boat. Well, let me go back just a moment. On one of the lifeboats, someone took a lady's petticoat and wrapped it around an oar and set it on fire so that they could signal other lifeboats so that they could maybe get together and get closer together so they weren't just all over the place. And when Dad went to on that lifeboat, Grandma volunteered her hat and her straw hat, and they set that on fire and signaled back. So she now was hatless. Dad went to sleep, finally. And when he awoke, there was a stirring among the passengers because they had seen a smudge of smoke on the horizon in the dawn. That, oh, there's a ship coming toward us. It's a long way away yet. But they started pulling at the oars and going toward it, as all the lifeboats that were out there started heading for this ship. And the ship was the Carpathia, which had come 4 hours and 58 miles and was too late to rescue everybody on the Titanic. And there were 20 lifeboats out there. Well, actually, there were only 18 lifeboats out there with people in them, because Mrs. Abbott, the half-swamped boat she was in, they were transferred to one of the other lifeboats in the night. And the other collapsible that didn't get off was upside down and had about 20 men standing on the keel of it all night long, trying to balance to keep it from capsizing. Several of them had frostbitten feet afterwards, because by the time they were transferred, they had been standing in icy water for some time. One of those men was a third-class steward by the name of Sidney Phillips, who was 18 years old at the time. And he later went back to England and went back to work on the Olympic, where he'd worked before, but also got married and had 7 kids, and one of those kids is in contact with me. Her name's, escapes me. Anyway, I'll think of her name. It's not really important. It's just that there are people like me in England who are able to tell the story. He had 7 kids. 3 of them are still around, I guess. finally, they got to the Carpathia, rather 7:30 maybe in the morning, and the ship had sunk at 2:20. So they'd been out there a while, and it was cold. Now the wind was starting to pick up, so there was a little bit of chop to the water. But on the right side of the ship, of the Carpathia, were out of the wind. They were either climbed up Jacob's ladders, rope webs, or my dad and other children were put into mail sacks and hoisted aboard. Well, you know what Dad did, first of all, was look for his pop, his daddy, look for people he knew. As it turned out, there was no father. After all the rescued people, 705 people were rescued out of 2,200, which means that about 1,500 people died that night, including my grandfather, Tom Theobald, and Alfred Rush. Dad cried a lot, and one of the firemen from the Titanic who had survived in a lifeboat as a crew member offered to take Dad and show him around the Carpathia because he knew people aboard the ship and keep him occupied. So grandmother joined several women, and they made clothes for little babies and toddlers that didn't have but night clothes, and they made clothes out of blankets and towels that the Carpathia survived, or provided for them. And that kept Grandma busy, and Sam Collins, this fireman from the Titanic, kept Dad busy, introduced him to crew on the Carpathia. They were in the crew's mess, and the crew offered to make Dad a noble seaman aboard the Carpathia, but he had to go through a initiation ritual. Well, Dad asked, what do you have to do? If I do what? That would be good to be a crewman. So they told him he had to drink what's the word? Some kind of oyster, Bombay oyster, which is a glass with half vinegar, half water, and a raw egg. And it had to all go down at once. Couldn't stop. Well, Dad did it. He's the same one that went up the cable. And so he was awarded a little pin of some sort and was an able seaman on the Carpathia. That kept him elated and busy and away from spending time looking for his dad. All of his posse perished. Not one of the kids that he ran around the ship with survived. Dad was the only one of that group. In fact, very few third-class children survived. Most of them were either younger or girls. Dad was 9 years old. I asked him one day, I said, well, give me an idea what it was like. He said, well, it was big. He said, it was like going to Disney when you were a kid. He said, everything was exciting and big. There's so much going on and so many things to look at and to see. He said, actually, it was pretty wonderful. He said, even the end was exciting because it was so big. When they were going into New York Harbor, it was raining. This was like Tuesday. There were like 20,000 people on the wharf, the pier, waiting for the ship to come in, the Carpathia to come in. And small boats were going around the Carpathia filled with reporters. who wanted information, and they were yelling up. One of them yelled up, and Dad had his head out a porthole. Said, "How many survivors are there?" And Dad said, incorrectly, "There are 710. Well, there were 710, but 5 died and were buried at sea. So there were actually 705. When they got to port, they went first to the White Star Line where the Titanic would have been docked, and unloaded all the lifeboats and left them there. And then they went to the Cunard dock because the Carpathia was a Cunard liner, and docked there. First off the boat was J. Bruce Ismay, the owner, who was taken care of right away, and then the first-class people, and then the second-class people, and later, and it's daylight by this time, the third-class people. So there they are in New York. Don't even have anything except what they wore. And Mrs. Macy at Macy's department store sent her limousine to bring people to the store. And they sat in the limousine inside. The driver was outside in the weather. And they were on the inside of Mrs. Macy's limousine. They went to the store, and they were presented with a steamer trunk and 2 wicker suitcases. The steamer trunk, they put towels and pots and pans and household goods. The wicker suitcases, they put personal items, one for Grandma and one for Dad, underwear and socks for him, and change of clothes and so on. And then the Salvation Army put them up overnight and provided them with tickets and a little bit of cash to get them to Detroit, Michigan, where they were, which was their ultimate goal, where her family was. And they took the train from New York to Detroit and were met by family. Once in Detroit, they were very, very poor. Grandma got a job for $5, $5 a week. Dad, excuse me, Dad wore so many patched clothes and mended that he got the nickname of Patches in school. Not a happy time for him. He didn't speak American, he spoke English, and they called him Patches. Their house where they lived was about 2 blocks from Navin Stadium. Navin Stadium is where the Detroit Tigers played. Every time somebody,
You want a mint?
I could use a glass of water. Every time somebody hit a home run or made a great play, the crowd roared. And to Dad, it was the sound of the Titanic sinking. I didn't realize. Oh, what do you got? A mint. All right. Maybe. Excuse me. It's a big mint. Thank you. I'm going to sing for you in a little bit. I need the glass of water. Where was I? Navin Stadium. Oh, as I was growing up, my dad never took me to a football game, baseball game, hockey game, or anything where there was a crowd roaring. I didn't know. Didn't know why. We didn't talk about the Titanic at home. I knew something about this ship that sank that took my grandfather, But my grandmother had remarried, so I had a different grandfather, and that was fine with me. I mean, I had grandma and grandpa. His name was Harry Illman. So it was Grandpa Illman and Grandma Illman, not Grandma Goldsmith. But that didn't bother me. That's just the way it was in our family. And we never, ever talked about the Titanic with my father. In fact, he would get very quiet in March or April, and we were told not to bother him. If he didn't want to talk, he wouldn't talk. Grandma didn't share the story with anybody. We lived in Ohio by this time, and Grandma and Grandpa Hillman built a little house on our property right next door. And when he retired, and they moved to Ohio. I grew up in a town called Ashland, which had a college, and I was able to go to Ashland College, the first member of the family to go to college. But I had to live at home because we couldn't afford dormitory too, but that was all right. I worked 2 or 3 jobs all through college. And one day when I came home, which I often did, my mom and dad were running a camera store in Mansfield, Ohio, 13 miles away. And I go home and have lunch with my grandma, and we listen to the Romance of Helen Trent on the radio, and I would eat lunch, and we would chat and talk. Well, one day she started talking about the Titanic, and she told me most of what I've told you today about how they packed, where they were, what happened aboard the ship, what happened in the lifeboat, what happened when they got to the Carpathia, and so on. I didn't realize that I was the only one in the family that heard Grandma tell the story. My brothers never did, because she didn't talk about it. And I thought, well, maybe I've got a lot of questions. Maybe I'll come back with a tape recorder, or wire recorder at that time. And I was 19. That's the first time I heard the story, the family story. 3 weeks later, Grandma took a trip back to Detroit to see relatives and over to Canada to see some friends. And when she was all done with her trip, she got back on the train, sat down in her seat, put the seat back, gave a big sigh, and died. Now, terrible shock to us all, but I always thought if she could have planned it, that's what she would have wanted to be, traveling with her boots on. So I always have thought she knew. She did things that seemed to know that her time was up. My dad and mother ran their business for 26 years, and after I moved to Florida, they moved to Florida. Then they moved back to Ohio, then they moved to Florida again, and we're in a mobile home down near Disney. I had a daughter by the name of Emily, who was around 5 or 6 years old at this time. And we went down to Mom and Dad's and spent the afternoon with them and dinner and so on. Had a nice day. Dad got down on the floor and played with my daughter. And it was a good day. I went home. We were getting ready for bed. Mom called and she said, "I think your dad's had a stroke and they're taking him to the hospital." I said, "Well, let me know. I'm just getting ready for bed, but I could come if you need me." She didn't want me to come, so I didn't. And he died in the hospital, or perhaps before they got him there. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered over the side of the Titanic by the Coast Guard patrol, the ice patrol that monitors the traveling of icebergs, something that was established after the Titanic sank. so there was constant tracking of icebergs. But they scattered his ashes over the site. Now, I will say that I saw a picture of the back of the airplane where the cargo doors were open and they were throwing the wreath out that they lay every year. And there was this box with my dad in it out in midair. I imagine it scattered when it hit. But that's where he wanted to be, not me. I'll be next to my wife and daughter who have since gone ahead of me. I don't know if I want to tell you one more thing about Grandma and Dad. In May, in 1912, after the sinking in April, or in the 1st of June, they got aboard a ship and went back to England. I don't know if I would have, but Grandma had a duty to perform. She needed to see her friend, Mrs. Theobald, and give her the wedding ring and tell her how her husband was on board the ship and so on. In fact, Mr. Theobald's body was found and is buried at Halifax, but the lining of his coat and everything had been ripped, and all of his money, which had been sewn into it, seemed to have disappeared somewhere. Grandpa was never found, nor was Alfred. But while they were there, they visited Grandpa's family, their in-laws, and Dad went and visited his friends at school, and they signed up for women and children's money that the British had collected in funds, and one for widows and one for orphans. And so they received a little bit of money every month from the widows and children's funds. Grandma saved all of Dad's in a special account, which later, in 1930 something, probably 37 or 38, provided a down payment for a house in Detroit. Grandma and Dad went and bought a house and then told my mother. So, ladies, you understand, if your husband goes out and buys a house with his mother and then tells you that's where you're going to live, you got to be really happy, huh? I don't think she ever forgave my grandmother or my dad for that little episode. Although I could walk through that house close my eyes, I know where everything in that house is, I think. And I moved out of there when I was 6. So, anyhow, that's my family story. A couple of years ago, I've been in Florida for 40 years now, and I was at a conference for the Titanic, and at the end of the conference, they played music called Requiem. It was composed by Barry Gibbs, which was in reference and reverence to the Titanic. And after it was over, I went up to the head of the conference, and I said, you know, Bill, I ought to write a poem or a song or something about So Long, Frankie. He said, well, write a song. So I had a year, and it wasn't going well. So along about 7 or 8 months later, I talked to some friends of mine from the theater group I was in. He played the piano, and she was one of the singer-dancers. And she said, well, let me help you with the lyrics, because I write poetry. Well, fine. And so Nola Ray helped me put together the poetry, the lyric, and Bob put together the music, and the three of us created a song called So Long, Frankie, I'll See You Later. Let me have a drink of water, then I will try to perform it for you. Without accompaniment. So long, Frankie, I'll see you later. Be strong and try not to cry. So long, Frankie. I'll see you later. That was my dad's last goodbye. On April the 10th, year 1912, when I was a lad only 9, I boarded a ship with my mother and dad, a ship the best of its kind, bound for adventure, the elite and the poor, ready to cross the Atlantic. Never dreamed the history about to be made on a ship better known as Titanic. I'll never forget the call that awoke us, the call to abandon the ship. With hearts filled with fear and grabbing our gear, a disastrous end to our trip. I clung to my mother, stayed close to my dad. I could hear his voice to this day. If we get separated, there's nothing to fear. These are the words he would say. So long, Frankie. I'll see you later. Be strong and try not to cry. So long, Frankie. I'll see you later. That was my dad's last goodbye. The sound in my head like 1,000 men cry. A gigantic black shadow then filled the sky as the stern broke apart from the famous Titanic, descending slowly in the deep, dark Atlantic. So long, Frankie. I'll see you later. My body's at rest in the sea. The sound of his voice and the touch of his hand are engraved in my memory.
Thank you, Frank.
I can almost do it without crying.
This has been wonderful.
I have one more thing I wanted to say. I want to talk to you about this picture for just a moment. These are the clothes that Grandma and Dad were wearing when they were rescued. This picture was taken 2 weeks later in Detroit by one of the newspapers. If you look at the hand on my dad's shoulder, Grandma has 2 wedding rings on, hers and Tom Theobald's. And that prompted the trip back to England. Just wanted to fill in that little bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.